Damien Marchetti had given orders that shut down ports overnight, orders that ended blood feuds between families who hadn't spoken in 3 decades, orders that moved billions of dollars before the ink was even dry. In 11 years running Marchetti Global, and the empire beneath it that never appeared on paper, no one in that boardroom had ever once questioned him twice, until the Monday he stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said the single strangest sentence any of them had heard him speak. From today forward, no man speaks to Autumn Sullivan without my permission. Nobody moved. Capos who had watched men disappear without blinking suddenly found the conference table fascinating. The lawyers exchanged the kind of glance that meant, did he really just say that? Even Marco, who'd run Damien's security detail for 6 years and thought he'd heard every order the man could give, felt his jaw tighten. Someone finally found the nerve. Boss. Is she compromised? Is someone targeting her? No. A leak? Did she see something she shouldn't have? No. Silence. Damien closed the folder in front of him like the matter was already finished. It's policy. No further explanation came. No one was foolish enough to ask for one twice. Within the hour, the order had reached every floor of the building. Executive assistants forwarded it to each other with question marks in the subject line. Security staff reread it twice, certain they'd misunderstood. A junior associate laughed out loud in the break room, then stopped because Damien Marchetti did not make jokes, and everyone in that room knew it. 2 floors down, the woman at the center of it all had no idea any of this was happening. Autumn Sullivan sat behind her desk, humming under her breath, adding a note to Thursday's calendar. A birthday cake for the night shift security team, flowers for the accountant whose father had just come home from the hospital, a thank you card for the maintenance crew, who'd stayed until 2 a.m. fixing the elevator. None of it was in her job description. She did it anyway, the way she'd done it for 3 years, remembering things no personnel file ever recorded. Which guard liked his coffee black? Which lawyer's daughter had just gotten into college, whose wedding anniversary fell on a Tuesday no one else would think to mark? When a coworker rushed over holding the new directive, Autumn read it once, then again, and shrugged. Huh, that's it, huh. I guess he wants things more organized. She smiled, already turning back to her screen. Fewer interruptions, maybe. The coworker didn't move right away. Something in her expression said she didn't believe that for a second, and neither really did anyone else in the building. By noon, the Whispers had a life of their own. Rival families. A leak in accounting. A federal informant, somewhere on the 40th floor. Nobody landed anywhere close to the truth, because nobody imagined the truth could be this simple, or this humiliating for a man like Damien Marchetti. From his office, through the glass wall that gave him a clean line to her desk, Damien watched Autumn work through her lunch hour again. She'd done it 3 times this week. He noticed the way she rubbed her wrist when she got tired, the way she always kept an extra granola bar in her top drawer for whichever assistant forgot to eat, the way she laughed, quick, unguarded, gone before anyone could really catch it, whenever someone said something even mildly funny near her desk. He told himself he watched her the way he watched everything, for threats, patterns, anything out of place. He'd been telling himself that for almost 3 years. It was a lie he was good enough at, that even he mostly believed it. At 2:15, a financial analyst named Ryan Cole stopped by Autumn's desk to thank her for catching an error in his quarterly report before it reached the board. It took him under 2 minutes. He said thank you. She smiled. He left. By 4:30, Ryan Cole had a transfer letter on his desk. Singapore office. Effective immediately. Relocation team already assembling his file. He read it twice, the way everyone had read the directive twice that morning. Positive there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. By the time the building's lights started clicking off, floor by floor, the story had already started moving through Marchetti Global, the way stories do in places built on secrets, quietly, urgently, mouth to ear. Someone thanked Autumn Sullivan for something small. Someone got reassigned to another continent by dinner. Nobody said it out loud yet. Nobody would, for a while. But by the end of that first week, the building had a nickname for what was happening, murmured in stairwells and elevators when they were sure no one important was listening. The transfers had officially begun. To understand why Damien Marchetti, a man who had never once let anyone close enough to matter, would quietly dismantle careers over an assistant he swore was just policy, You have to go back 3 years, to the week she first walked into his office and did something no one else in the building had ever survived doing. She told him no. By the second week, the transfers had officially begun, had become something closer to a company legend. The kind of story people told in hushed voices near the coffee machine, half joking, half genuinely rattled. Autumn, for her part, kept doing what she'd always done. She remembered that Deb from legal had a daughter starting kindergarten that Wednesday and left a small congratulations card on her desk before anyone else thought of it. She remembered that Pryor's wife was going in for surgery on Thursday and quietly rearranged Pryor's calendar so she could leave early without having to explain herself to anyone. She knew that Frank in security took his coffee black, no sugar, and that Miguel took his with 3 creams and pretended he didn't. She remembered that it was Harold's 30-year retirement anniversary next month and had already started a card that half the building would end up signing without being asked twice. She never wrote any of it down. She didn't need to. It just lived in her, the way some people remember song lyrics or sports scores. The night shift crew adored her most of all. The ones nobody upstairs ever thought about. The ones who kept the building running while the executives slept. Autumn left muffins in the break room fridge with their names taped to the bags. She learned their kids' names. She asked about them and actually listened to the answers. Everyone loved her, quietly, carefully, from a distance that kept growing week by week for reasons nobody could quite explain out loud, because the pattern had started to repeat itself in a way that was impossible to ignore. Someone brought Autumn coffee from the good place 2 blocks over. Gone by Friday, reassigned to the Chicago office. Someone sat with her at lunch and made her laugh so hard she nearly choked on her sandwich. Gone within the week. An opportunity in the Dallas branch, apparently. Though no one remembered Dallas needing anyone, someone complimented the scarf she was wearing. Gone. Someone held the elevator for her and made small talk about the weather for 4 floors. Gone by Monday. It got to the point where people started keeping a mental tally. Half as a joke, half because it genuinely unsettled them. Someone in HR, nobody ever admitted who, started calling it the Autumn Curse, and it stuck the way office nicknames do, spoken low enough that it never quite reached the executive floor, but loud enough that everyone below it knew exactly what it meant. Lorenzo Ricci noticed it before anyone else did, because noticing things was, in a sense, his entire job. He'd known Damien since they were 17, since long before Marchetti Global existed, since the version of Damien that still occasionally laughed at something without calculating the cost of it first. Lorenzo had watched him build an empire out of nothing but discipline and a complete refusal to be predictable, which was exactly why the pattern bothered him so much. Because it was predictable. Painfully so, if you knew where to look. He started paying attention. Really paying attention. And what he found made him want to laugh, except laughing at Damien Marchetti wasn't something people tended to survive doing twice. Every transfer followed the same sequence. A man spoke to Autumn. Autumn smiled, or laughed, or seemed even briefly genuinely pleased, and within hours, sometimes less, Damien would appear in HR's doorway with a name and a location, calm as ever, offering no room for discussion. Lorenzo watched it happen a 3rd time. A young associate making Autumn laugh so hard she covered her mouth with her hand and watched Damien's jaw tighten from clear across the room and finally understood. It wasn't security. It wasn't policy. Damien Marchetti, the single most feared man in 3 states, was jealous. Lorenzo didn't say anything. Not yet. But he started watching Damien the way Damien watched everyone else, carefully, and with the distinct, growing sense that his oldest friend was about to make a catastrophic mistake without even realizing he'd started. Autumn, meanwhile, had begun to notice something too, though she read it entirely differently. The hallway outside her desk, which used to be full of easy conversation, had gone quiet. People who used to stop and chat on their way to the break room now offered a tight smile and kept walking. Lunch invitations, which used to come at least twice a week, had stopped coming at all. Even Pryor, who she genuinely considered a friend, had started finding reasons to eat at her own desk. Autumn told herself it was nothing. A busy season. People had their own lives, their own deadlines, but the quiet kept stretching, day after day, until it started to feel less like coincidence and more like something she'd done. She replayed conversations in her head, searching for the moment she'd said something wrong, been too much, made someone uncomfortable without meaning to. She came up with nothing, which somehow made it worse. She started eating lunch alone at her desk, telling herself she preferred it that way. She didn't. The break came on a Thursday, when a young operations manager named Tom stopped by to return a folder and stayed a beat too long, making her laugh about something small and forgettable. Damien saw it from the hallway, just a flicker of it. Autumn's hand pressed briefly over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with a laugh she hadn't planned on. By 6 that evening, Tom's transfer papers were already signed. Overseas division. No discussion. No appeal. No explanation offered to anyone, least of all Tom. Lorenzo found Damien alone in his office afterward, staring out at the city like it had personally offended him. "You know this isn't security anymore," Lorenzo said quietly, closing the door behind him. "Not for a long time now." Damien didn't turn around. "I'm not asking what it is," Lorenzo added. "I already know what it is. I'm asking how much longer you think you can keep calling it something else." Damien said nothing at all, and in the silence that followed, Lorenzo understood that his oldest friend already knew exactly what he was doing and had absolutely no idea how to stop. Damien didn't answer Lorenzo that night. He didn't answer him the next morning either. But long after Lorenzo had gone home, Damien stayed in his office with the lights low and let himself think about the beginning, something he rarely allowed himself to do. 3 years earlier, Autumn Sullivan had walked into Marquette Global for a job interview wearing a slightly wrinkled blazer and an expression that suggested she had no idea who she was about to sit across from. Within the first 10 minutes, she had corrected an error in his own calendar, out loud, in front of 2 board members. "You're double-booked Thursday," she'd said, not even looking up from the printed schedule someone had handed her to review. The Kessler call and the Ritchie meeting are both at 2. Nobody corrected Damien Marchetti to his face. Certainly not a 28-year-old candidate who hadn't even been hired yet. He'd waited for the room to go quiet, the way it always did whenever anyone misjudged how much room they had to speak freely around him. Instead, Autumn had simply looked up, entirely unbothered, and asked which meeting he wanted to keep. He hired her 20 minutes later. Over the weeks that followed, she never asked for the things people usually asked for once they realized who he really was. No favors. No introductions to people who mattered. No hints that she understood exactly how much power moved through his office every day. She refused the reserved parking spot that came with her position, saying the one 2 rows back was perfectly fine, honestly. She turned down the company car service twice before he simply stopped offering and started quietly ensuring a driver was always available anyway, without telling her why. She stood up to him, not with defiance, but with a kind of calm, respectful honesty that no one else in his life had ever bothered with. She told him when his temper made a room worse instead of better. She told him once, gently, that raising his voice at a nervous new hire wouldn't make the mistake unhappen any faster. He'd expected to be furious. Instead, he found himself oddly, quietly relieved, as if some part of him had been waiting years for someone to talk to him like he was simply a person who occasionally got things wrong. Not an empire, not a threat, not a legend people either feared or tried to use. That was, he understood only in hindsight when it had started. It grew slowly. In small moments, she never seemed to register as significant. She remembered his mother's birthday the first year, without being told, and left a card on his desk with a note that said, only, "I hope today is a good one." His mother had been gone for 6 years by then. No one else in the building even knew her name. She found the cracked frame holding his father's photograph, the only one he kept tucked in a drawer rather than displayed, and quietly had it replaced with a new one, glass intact, placed back exactly where she'd found it, never once mentioning she'd done it. During the Kessler collapse 18 months ago, when 3 deals fell apart in the same week and the whole company seemed to be holding its breath, she stayed until 2 in the morning, 3 nights running, not because anyone asked her to, but because she said someone needed to keep the coffee coming and the panic contained. She never once asked for recognition, never mentioned it afterward, never used it as leverage, the way everyone around him eventually did, sooner or later, whether they meant to or not. Damien had fallen in love with her so slowly and so completely that by the time he recognized it for what it was, it already felt less like a discovery and more like something he'd simply always known, and that terrified him more than anything his enemies had ever done. Because in his world, love wasn't just inconvenient, it was a liability with a name and an address. Every man he'd ever destroyed had been undone, eventually, by exactly one thing: someone they couldn't afford to lose, someone their enemies could find and use against them. He taught himself, over and over, that the rule protected her, that keeping men at a distance kept her invisible to anyone who might think to use her against him, that it was strategy, not weakness, policy, not feeling. He almost believed it. He'd built an entire empire on believing things hard enough that they became true. Lorenzo found him again the following evening, standing at the window the way he always did when he didn't want to be looked at directly. "I'll ask you once, plainly," Lorenzo said, "and then I'll leave it alone. Are you protecting her, Damien, or are you protecting you from what it would mean to actually lose her?" Damien said nothing. The silence went on long enough that it answered the question on its own, the way silence always eventually does with people who've known each other since they were 17. Lorenzo didn't push further. He simply nodded once, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected, and let himself out. Below, on the 12th floor, Autumn sat alone at her desk again, lunch untouched beside her keyboard. The hallway outside had been empty for nearly an hour. She'd stopped waiting for anyone to stop by. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself people had their own lives, their own schedules, nothing personal in any of it. But when she finally gave up pretending to work and let her head drop into her hands, the tears came quietly the way she did everything, without wanting anyone to notice, without wanting to be a burden to a single person in the building. Above her, through the glass wall of his office, Damien watched. He told himself, the way he always did, that this was simply what protection looked like, that the isolation was a small price for her safety, that someday, somehow, she would understand. He had no idea, standing there in the dark with the city glittering behind him, that the very thing he believed was shielding her heart was the exact thing quietly breaking it. Vanessa Hale had spent 6 years climbing toward a seat close enough to Damien Marchetti to matter, and she'd done it the way she did everything, carefully, strategically, without wasting a single move. So when she looked at Autumn Sullivan, an assistant with no MBA, no family name, no obvious leverage, sitting closer to the center of Damien's trust than she had ever managed to get, the only explanation that made sense to her was the one that made her feel less foolish. Autumn had to be doing something. Nobody earned that kind of proximity by accident. It started small. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there. Interesting that she's the only one who never gets reassigned. Passed along at the right lunch table. It grew the way rumors grow in places built on secrets, gaining detail with every retelling until nobody could quite remember where it had started. By the end of the week, half the building had a version of the story. Autumn knew something dangerous about Damien and used it as leverage. Autumn had manipulated her way into his confidence. Autumn's promotions, the trust, the access, the quiet deference everyone from HR to security showed her, weren't earned. They were extracted. None of it was true. All of it spread anyway. The way lies always seem to travel faster than the truth ever bothers to. The moment it stopped being whispers came during the quarterly leadership meeting, in front of 11 executives, 2 board members, and Damien himself, who arrived 4 minutes late from a call he couldn't reschedule. Vanessa had planned it well. She waited until the room had settled, then turned to Autumn, who was there only to take notes, as she always was, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Autumn, sweetheart, maybe you can explain something to the room. How exactly does someone with no formal experience end up sitting in on strategy meetings the rest of us had to earn our way into?" The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence after Damien's original order, sharper, meaner, aimed at one specific person instead of spread evenly across a startled crowd. "I take notes," Autumn said carefully. "That's all." "Is it?" Vanessa's smile widened. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like influence, and I think everyone here deserves to know how you earned it." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved around the table. Not at Vanessa, not really at Autumn either, but at the sheer tension of watching something happen that no one knew how to stop. Autumn didn't defend herself. She never did. She simply folded her hands on top of her notepad, kept her eyes down. and let it wash over her the way she'd learned to let most things wash over her. Quietly, without complaint, absorbing the damage so no one else had to. Damien walked in 90 seconds later, expecting a discussion about supply chain logistics, and instead found Vanessa mid-sentence and Autumn sitting frozen and small in a room full of people who'd clearly already decided what they believed. He shut it down instantly. A single look at Vanessa was enough to end the sentence in her mouth, but 90 seconds had already happened. The damage had already landed in front of everyone in a room Autumn couldn't leave without making it worse. Afterward, Damien did the only thing he knew how to do with a threat. He tightened security. New restrictions went out within the day. Fewer people cleared for the executive floor. Tighter access controls. A formal review of who was permitted to speak with Autumn during working hours. For efficiency, 2 more transfers followed by Friday. Employees who'd done nothing worse than defend her quietly in the break room. He believed completely that this was protection, that making the walls higher would make her safer. It didn't occur to him, not once, not for a second, that what Autumn actually needed in that moment was someone to sit beside her and say, "I saw what happened, and it wasn't your fault. It made everything worse." The restrictions didn't quiet the rumors, they confirmed them. If Autumn truly had nothing to hide, people reasoned, why did the walls keep getting higher every time someone questioned her? Autumn felt the shift immediately. The careful, tight-lipped distance from before curdled into something closer to suspicion. People who used to avoid her out of confusion now avoided her out of something closer to distrust. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, in the small kitchen on the 12th floor, where she'd gone to refill her water bottle and overheard 2 junior associates near the vending machines, unaware she was close enough to hear. "I actually like her," one of them said, keeping his voice low, "but it's not worth it. You say 2 words to Sullivan and your career's basically over. I've got a family, man. I can't afford to be the next transfer. Our careers end if we speak to her." The other one agreed. "It's not personal. It's just not worth the risk." Autumn stood perfectly still in the doorway, water bottle forgotten in her hand, and felt something inside her go very quiet. It's not personal. They weren't wrong to protect themselves. She understood that, even as it broke something loose in her chest. This wasn't rumor or misunderstanding anymore. This was fact, stated plainly, by 2 people who had nothing to gain by lying. She had become a career hazard, a liability with a name and a desk on the 12th floor. She walked back to her office without a word to anyone, sat down at her desk, and stared at her monitor for a long time without seeing it. Then she opened a blank document and began slowly to type. "Dear Damien," she stopped. Started again. "I've thought about this for a long time, and I think it's best for everyone if..." She stopped a second time, closed the document without saving it, and sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the city outside her window until the sky started to darken. She would write it properly tomorrow, somewhere she wouldn't get interrupted. 2 floors above her, behind the glass wall it started to think of as a kind of quiet vigil, Damien reviewed the new security protocols and felt, for the first time in days, something close to satisfaction. He had no idea what she'd just started to write. Autumn came in early the next morning, before most of the building had even turned its lights on, and did the things she always did. One last time, though she told herself not to think of it that way yet. She finished Damien's calendar for the week, filling in the gaps she'd normally leave for herself to adjust as the days shifted. She made his coffee exactly the way he liked it. Black 1 sugar made fresh rather than reheated, because he always noticed the difference even when he pretended not to, and set it on his desk before he arrived, the way she'd done nearly every morning for 3 years. She wrote instructions for whoever would take over, which vendor handled the flowers for the accounting department, which security guard's birthday fell at the end of the month, how Damien liked his schedule structured on days with board calls versus days without. She wrote it all clearly, thoroughly, the way she did everything, because even now, leaving, she couldn't bring herself to leave a mess behind for someone else to untangle. Then she began the notes, small ones mostly, a card for Priya, thanking her for the years of lunches, even the recent ones that hadn't happened. A note for the night shift crew tucked where they'd find it, telling them the muffins would keep coming as long as she had anything to do with it. And if she didn't, she hoped someone else would pick it up. A card for Marco, for Deb, for Frank, who took his coffee black, and Miguel, who lied about his creams. Small, quiet acknowledgements of people who'd mattered to her, whether or not they'd known it. The last one took the longest. She started it 3 times before the words came the way she wanted them to. Not angry. She wasn't angry, not really, just tired and sad and certain, in the particular quiet way grief settles once a decision has actually been made, that this was the only choice left that didn't hurt anyone else. Dear Damien, by the time you read this, I'll already be gone, and I want you to know that isn't meant as anything dramatic. It's just easier this way, for both of us, but especially for everyone else. Thank you for 3 years of trusting me with things most people never trust an assistant with. For every early morning and every late night, you never once made me feel bad about staying for. I've learned more here than I think you know, and I've been prouder of this work than I've probably ever told you. I'm sorry. I know the new policy came from somewhere, and I've never asked why, because it never felt like my place to. But I've watched what it's done. To people who did nothing wrong except be kind to me. To a building that used to feel warm and doesn't anymore. I never wanted anyone hurt because of me. Not once. And I can't keep watching it happen and pretend I don't understand that I'm the reason. Please tell everyone I hope things go back to normal soon. I hope Tom's transfer works out for him. I hope Ryan likes Singapore. I hope, honestly, that everyone ends up exactly where they're supposed to be, including you. Then, you work too hard and eat too little, and there's no one left to remind you of that now. So please remember on your own. Thank you again for everything. Autumn. She read it twice, folded it once, and set it in the center of his desk, propped against the untouched coffee cup where he couldn't possibly miss it. Then she packed the last of her things, a framed photo, a spare cardigan, the granola bars from her top drawer, into a single box small enough to carry in one arm, and walked out through the 12th floor without saying goodbye to anyone because she knew if she tried, she wouldn't make it to the elevator. Nobody saw her leave. That was, in its own way, exactly the point. Damien arrived 40 minutes later than usual, delayed by a call with a supplier in Marseille, already composing in his head the 3 things he needed. Autumn to move on his calendar. He noticed the quiet before he noticed anything else. Her desk, usually a small organized chaos of sticky notes and half-finished tasks, was empty. Bare. The drawers, when he checked without quite understanding why he was checking, were cleared out entirely. His office door was open. The coffee sat exactly where she'd left it, untouched, gone cold. He saw the envelope before he let himself think about what it meant. He read it standing up, because sitting down felt like it would make it real too quickly. And by the 3rd line, something in his chest had already gone cold in a way. No threat, no rival. No decade of violence had ever managed to make him feel. I never wanted anyone hurt because of me. She'd apologized. She hadn't accused him of anything, hadn't mentioned jealousy or possessiveness or the wall of restrictions he built around her a brick at a time. She'd simply, quietly, decided she was the problem and removed herself to fix it. He read it a 2nd time, a 3rd. Lorenzo found him there minutes later, letter still in hand, and stopped in the doorway at the sight of something he had genuinely never seen in 20 years of friendship. Damien Marchetti's hands were shaking. Damien, I drove her away. His voice came out low, almost unrecognizable, stripped of every ounce of the calm control that had built an empire. I did this. I did every part of this. Lorenzo didn't try to argue with him, because there wasn't anything true to argue. Damien set the letter down with a care that didn't match the panic underneath it, straightened, and by the time he turned around, something in his expression had shifted, from grief into motion, the way it always did with him because standing still had never once been something he knew how to survive. Get everyone, he said, every team we have, I don't care what they're working on. To bring her back? Lorenzo asked carefully. No, Damien's voice caught, just slightly on the word. To ask her. Just ask her if she'll give me 10 minutes to say I'm sorry. That's all. That's the only thing I want. He picked up the letter one more time, folded it carefully along its original creases, and held it like something breakable. Find Autumn, he said. Please. They found her by early afternoon. Not far. Just a small coffee shop 3 blocks from our apartment. The kind of place she used to disappear to on hard days, because no one from the office ever thought to look there. She hadn't answered her phone. She wasn't ready to. But the annual leadership summit had been scheduled for weeks, immovable, and by the time Damien learned where she was, he was already 40 minutes from having to walk into a ballroom full of the company's most powerful people and pretend none of this had happened. He asked Lorenzo to send a car for her anyway, not to force anything, just to let her know, quietly, that if she wanted to be there, for herself, not for him, a seat would be waiting. She came. She never told anyone exactly why, not even herself entirely. She slipped in near the back of the room just as Vanessa Hale was rising to speak, and found a seat in the shadows where she could watch without being seen. Vanessa had clearly been waiting for this moment. "Before we move into quarterly projections," she said smoothly, addressing the room but angling herself just enough toward Damien, "I think it's worth revisiting something several of us have raised concerns about. The unusual, I'll be generous and call it unconventional, level of access certain non-executive staff have been given to sensitive strategic decisions." A murmur moved through the room. Board members exchanged glances. Vanessa let the silent stretch exactly long enough to matter. "Specifically," she continued, "Autumn Sullivan, an assistant with no formal training in corporate strategy whose sudden influence over Mr. Marchetti's decisions has frankly raised questions about whether this company is being run on merit or on something else entirely." The insult landed exactly the way Vanessa intended it to. Sharp and public, dressed up as concern. In the back of the room, Autumn went very still. Damien rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table, and the room fell into the particular silence it always fell into when he stood. The silence of people who understood instinctively that something significant was about to happen. "You want to question her qualifications," he said. "Then let's do that properly." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 3 years ago, Autumn caught a scheduling conflict that would have cost this company the Kessler deal before it ever started. 18 months ago, during the Kessler collapse, she was the reason 3 separate agreements didn't fall apart entirely, while half this room was too busy panicking to think clearly. He looked around the table, unhurried. "She's caught contract errors that would have cost us 7 figures. Twice. She's the reason our night security team has stayed fully staffed for 3 years running in an industry with 40% turnover, because she's the only person in this building who ever bothered to learn their names." Vanessa's confidence flickered, just slightly. "She has saved this company more money, more relationships, and more careers than anyone currently sitting at this table," Damien continued, "including mine. So if we're discussing merit, Vanessa, I'd suggest we start there." The room had gone completely silent now, the kind of silence that has weight to it. "Pause." And then, for the first time in 11 years of running an empire built on never showing anyone anything they could use against him, he kept going anyway. "There's something else you should all know," he said, "since apparently I owe this room an explanation I never gave." Lorenzo, seated near the front, went very still. "I never banned men from speaking to her, because she was in danger." The silence deepened, impossibly further. "I banned them," Damien said, and for the first time in longer than Lorenzo could remember, his voice wasn't entirely steady, "because I couldn't bear watching another man make her smile." Nobody moved. Somewhere near the back of the room, though he didn't know it yet, Autumn's hand had come up to cover her mouth. "I trusted her before I loved her," he continued, quieter now, the words coming like something finally being set down after being carried too long. "And I loved her long before I ever let myself admit it, to her or to anyone, including myself." Even the captains at the far end of the table, men who had watched Damien Marchetti end wars without blinking, sat in stunned silence, staring at a version of him none of them had ever seen. "So, no," Damien said, turning finally toward Vanessa, his composure returning just enough to finish what he'd started. "This company isn't being run on favoritism. It's being run, in no small part, by a woman I was too much of a coward to simply tell the truth to. And that's on me, not her." Vanessa opened her mouth, found nothing sufficient to say, and closed it again. In the back of the room, Autumn sat frozen, every strange, painful, incomprehensible piece of the last month rearranging itself in real time behind her eyes. The men who kept disappearing. Ryan, Tom, all of them, not punished for anything they'd done wrong, but for the unbearable crime of making her laugh in front of a man who couldn't stand to watch it happen without wanting to be the reason instead. The empty hallways, the silent lunches, the careful distance that had grown between her and everyone she cared about. Not because she'd done something wrong, not because people had quietly decided to dislike her, but because an entire building had learned, one transfer at a time, that being kind to her came at a cost none of them could afford. Our careers end if we speak to her. It hadn't been about her at all. It had never been about her. It had been about him. About jealousy dressed up as protection, about 3 years of feelings he'd never once said out loud, expressed instead through an increasingly absurd, increasingly destructive policy that had cost good people their positions and cost her slowly and quietly nearly everything she thought she understood about her place in this building. She sat very still, hand still pressed over her mouth, and felt something inside her chest crack open. Not entirely from grief anymore, and not entirely from anger either. Something closer, unexpectedly, to understanding. Damien hadn't looked toward the back of the room once during any of it. He had no idea she was even there. But she was, and she had heard every word. The room emptied slowly after Damien finished speaking. Board members and captains filing out in a silence none of them seemed to know how to break. Vanessa left first, and quickly, without another word to anyone. Autumn stayed in her seat until the room had nearly cleared, unsure whether she wanted to be found or not. In the end, it didn't matter. Damien turned toward the back of the room out of some old instinct, the same one that had tracked her presence through glass walls and security monitors for 3 years, and stopped completely still when he saw her there. Neither of them said anything at first. He crossed the room slowly, like a man approaching something he was afraid might disappear if he moved too fast. "You heard all of it?" he said quietly. "Yes." He nodded, jaw tight, and for a long moment simply looked at her the way he never let himself look at her when other people were around. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not an explanation, not a defense, just, I'm sorry, for all of it. Damien, let me finish." His voice was steadier than it had been in the ballroom, but only barely. "I was selfish. I told myself for 3 years that I was protecting you. And the truth is, I was protecting myself from ever having to say something and risk you saying no. I was jealous of men who did nothing wrong except talk to you, and instead of admitting that, I destroyed their careers and called it policy. I was afraid, and I let that fear cost you your friends, your peace, nearly your job. That's not protection. That's just fear wearing a nicer name." Autumn was quiet for a moment, studying him in a way that made him feel more exposed than any boardroom confession had. "Do you know what it's like?" she said finally. "To be protected by someone who never trusts you enough to tell you why? It doesn't feel like safety, Damien. It feels like a cage with very nice furniture. I spent a month thinking everyone hated me. I spent weeks blaming myself for things that were never mine to carry. That's not love. Love can't live inside that kind of fear. It just suffocates quietly until there's nothing left to protect." "I know," he said. "I understand that now. I should have understood it 3 years ago." She let out a breath, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, though not all of it. "So what happens now?" Damien hesitated, genuinely hesitated, the way she'd never once seen him do, in a boardroom or anywhere else. "You're not my assistant anymore," he said. "You made that decision, and I understand why, and I'm not going to ask you to undo it. But if you're not my assistant anymore—" He paused, and for the first time all day, something almost like nervousness crossed his face. "May I earn the chance to become the man who actually deserves you, not as your boss, just as a man who's finally telling you the truth?" Autumn stared at him for a long moment, and then, despite everything, despite the tears still sitting close to the surface, she laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't let herself have in weeks. "So that's why everyone kept getting transferred," she said. 3 years of chaos because you couldn't just say you liked me. When you put it that way, it sounds significantly worse." "It was significantly worse, Damien." But she was still laughing, and so finally was he. Quietly at first, then more fully, years of tension breaking loose between them all at once. Right there in the Antu ballroom neither of them had expected to end up in. Several months later, Marchetti Global looked, in most ways, like an entirely different company. The old policy was gone, quietly retired the same week Damien had made his confession public, though the story of it had, inevitably, spread through every floor of the building within days. Employees had taken to calling it the Orton policy with a fondness that would have been unthinkable a few months earlier, telling the story at holiday parties with increasing embellishment each time. Ryan Cole came back from Singapore with a girlfriend and a genuinely good opinion of the transfer. All things considered, Tom returned from overseas with a stack of photos and an outrageous story about a mishap with airport customs that made even Lorenzo laugh out loud. One by one, the formerly displaced stripped of back, most of them treating the whole ordeal as an accidental adventure rather than a grievance. Autumn didn't return as an assistant. Instead, 3 months after that boardroom confession, she was named Chief Executive Operations Advisor, a title created specifically because the board, having finally seen the full scope of what she'd quietly done for the company over 3 years, agreed unanimously that she'd more than earned it. Damien remained protective in his way. He still noticed when she skipped lunch. He still watched the door when she walked into a room, but he'd learned, slowly and deliberately, the difference between controlling something out of fear and simply choosing, every day, to trust the person standing in front of him. One evening, long after the office had emptied, and the cleaning crews had come and gone, Damien and Autumn stood together in the executive boardroom, the same room where an absurd order had once frozen an entire company in stunned silence. Damien looked around the quiet room and smiled, faintly. "This is where I made the worst decision of my life." Autumn stepped beside him and slipped her hand into his. "And this is where you finally made the best one." Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered beneath the night sky, indifferent and enormous, the way it always had been. The empire still belonged to Damien Marchetti. The deals, the power, the careful architecture of fear that had kept it standing for over a decade. But the fear that had once ruled him no longer did. Every rival family, every hostile takeover, every dangerous negotiation across 11 years had failed to touch him. It had taken one compassionate plus-size assistant who chose, quietly and without malice, to simply walk away to finally change his heart for good. That's a wrap on Damien Autumn's story. If this hit you right in the feels, drop a comment below. Did you see the Autumn policy twist coming? Or did it catch you off guard like it caught the whole office? Tell me which chapter broke your heart the most, and which one healed it back. Follow for more slow-burn mafia romances just like this one. New stories drop every week.